From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with the question of how much is enough. It is becoming clear today that the U.S. military buildup in the Persian Gulf may be far from over. The Bush administration is now in the process of making decisions that could result in thousands of additional troops being sent to the Gulf, as well as thousands of replacement men and women for those already there whose morale is such the Pentagon thinks they should come home before long, which also means a likely massive rotation of equipment, all of which will cost a fortune. We have reports from Washington and from Saudi Arabia. First, here is ABC's Bob Zelnick.
Iraq's apparent commitment to dig in and defend its conquest of Kuwait has, according to Defense Secretary Cheney, led the U.S. to continue its own military buildup.
We've not yet settled on an upper limit in terms of our total deployment. So for a number of reasons, I would expect there will be a continuing flow of forces to the Gulf in the period immediately ahead.
This continuing buildup will expand the capability of U.S. forces to go on the offensive, and that capability will be increased further by the replacement or rotation of U.S. troops already in the Gulf. For example, officials expect the lightly armed 12,000-manned 82nd Airborne Division to be home for Christmas. It is likely to be replaced by a 15,000-man armored or mechanized infantry division from the U.S. or Germany. In addition, units going home will not leave until their replacements have acclimated themselves to the area. That overlap could mean that next February or March, when the rotation is in full swing, U.S. troop strength in the Gulf could temporarily increase by up to 50%. But the rotation could also produce some staggering problems and some staggering new costs. Army plans call for armored divisions to take their tanks, personnel carriers, and other heavy equipment home with them so they can continue training. Replacing them with new units and their equipment will cost hundreds of millions of dollars and add to the military's strained sea lift capability. The Army maintains this is still more efficient than shuffling other equipment among bases within the United States. Some specialty Army units cannot now be rotated. They are trained in such areas as transportation and civil administration and must remain in Saudi Arabia while new units are trained from scratch. And the Marines have more than half their available combat troops already in the Gulf. To rotate them, sources say the Marines plan to call up between 3,000 and 10,000 combat reserves. Officials here say that rotating troops after 6 months in the Saudi desert was always central to the operations planning. In practice, it means that whether they remain on the defensive or go on the attack, a very large U.S. force could be in place for a long time to come. Bob Zelnick, ABC News at the Pentagon.
Well, the rotation may solve a morale problem, but as Bob Zelnick noted, it also creates an enormous logistics problem, moving the heavy equipment along with the personnel. As ABC's Bill Dicker reports from Saudi Arabia tonight, the troops in the field think their bosses at the Pentagon may not be going about it the right way.
They were the first to arrive. They would be the first to depart. The 82nd Airborne travels light. Its jeeps armed with mobile tow missiles and its compact Sheridan tanks go where the troops go and do so easily.
Fire, on the way!
But for the Army's more heavily armed divisions, it's another matter. Transporting, unloading, and deploying the heavy armor, especially the massive M1 tanks, has taken weeks. And the job is not done yet. The Army says some of the tanks it needs still have not arrived. If troops are rotated as the Pentagon plans, those in the field are assuming it makes sense to leave the heavy equipment here.
No, the equipment will stay in place. If we rotate, like we rotate our folks out, the equipment's going to stay.
For example, military officials here say Patriot anti-aircraft missile batteries should stay put. They say to swap them with those in Germany would temporarily leave Western Europe exposed without its premier air defense system. Cobra and Black Hawk helicopters could be rotated, but their replacements would have to be modified to endure the heat and sand. Those here already have been customized. Why do it twice? But the Pentagon believes it's worth doing twice to give its men a break and give them the equipment they're used to for training. Any rotation plan, especially if it includes a lot of equipment, would be complicated and costly, but necessary to maintain morale. Only 2.5 months after it began, Operation Desert Shield is suffering from a classic military complaint the troops want to go home. The harsh conditions, isolation, lack of information, and frustration over Saudi restrictions on everything from beer to live fire exercises has made rotation the #1 issue among soldiers.
I'm anxious to hear the plan, and I'm hoping that I'm one of the first to get rotated out of here.
We haven't heard nothing, and we're just planning for 6 months.
When do you want to go?
About 10 minutes.
It won't be that soon, and it won't be simple. But many soldiers here would be a lot happier if they at least knew when they were leaving. Bill Redeker, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
CIA Director William Webster said today he doubts the Gulf region can be secure again unless some kind of military force remains in the area to counter the influence of Saddam Hussein. The only other solution, says Mr. Webster, is for Iraq's weapons to be destroyed, although he didn't explain how that might be done. And here's an irony. At a time when the U.S. is prepared to spend perhaps billions of dollars more to send even more troops to Saudi Arabia, the government is also obliged to spend $2 billion to feed the Iraqi army. That's right, the army which the U.S. may have to fight. Here's our national security correspondent, John McWethy.
The Iraqis are eating American wheat, corn, and rice that the U.S. Department of Agriculture sold to Iraq before the invasion of Kuwait. Half of all imported Iraqi grain came from the U.S. What is worse, it turns out the grain will, in effect, be free, a gift from American taxpayers. To enable Iraq and other nations to buy American surplus grain, the United States had offered to guarantee loans from American banks. By last year, Iraq was the biggest single customer for these special loans, allowing Saddam Hussein to buy food on credit while using his cash to buy weapons. Iraq has now defaulted on all these loans, leaving the U.S. government to pay the bills. Last week, the Department of Agriculture, the USDA, was obliged to begin writing multi-million-dollar checks to the banks that made those loans.
USDA had a mission, as did farmers in this country, as did banks. They all made money. And for the USDA, it was to unload the surplus grain. To farmers, it was to sell their produce. For banks, it was to make a profit on the loan. The only loser was the United States government.
Government officials estimate that it could cost the U.S. about $2 billion to cover all the Iraqi loans. In the meantime, all that free American corn, wheat, and rice is helping to feed the Iraqi army. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
One other note from the Middle East, the government of Israel has said no to the UN Security Council again. The Council, with U.S. support, has passed another resolution calling on Israel to allow a UN investigation of the Palestinian deaths in Jerusalem this month. In a moment, what the budget proposal is most likely to mean on taxes. On the American agenda tonight, new options for patients to consider when surgery may not be absolutely necessary. And finally, St. Louis's Gateway Arch at 25.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Glade.